What is up, everyone? Well, you know how much love I have for presidential history here in the United States. It's one of those areas that I've spent a lot of time studying throughout my life. It's something I love talking about, and it seems to be something that you guys love hearing about because presidential history videos always do really well on this channel. So I've had a lot of requests for me, especially after I did my collaboration with Mr. Beat last year, in which we did a live stream and we did a tier ranking of the presidents. I've had a lot of requests for me to actually do a ranking where I go from number 1 all the way down to number 45 on the presidents, to rank them in order. So I'm going to do that today. And before we get into it, I want to just give you a little bit of my criteria that I'm going to be using, talk about some of my own biases, and then show you some of the resources I'm going to be using to put this all together. So let's go ahead and dive in. All right, so first things first, I just want to say that everybody has their own biases. I tend to lean toward the conservative side, lean toward kind of a balance between state and federal government power, things like that. And, you know, I certainly have my favorites and the folks I don't like. And so I'm going to tend to probably inflate the people that I like personally as president and probably devalue some people that I don't like. I'm going to try not to judge these presidents on character so much as performance. And for me, the main criteria is, was their presidency a net positive or a net negative, not only for the world, but especially for the United States, because their role as president of the United States. So to me, what they did for their own country matters a lot more than what they did that might have benefited other countries. So I know some of you in other countries are going to say, well, this particular president was great for our nation. Well, that's great. I'm not part of your nation. I'm judging how he performed for our nation. So those are some of the things. I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about each of these guys, going through all the details of the pluses and minuses of their presidency. I don't want this to be like a 3 or 4 hour long video. So we're going to just briefly talk about each one of them. And I've got this site here, apnotes.net, which gives a little bit of a summary of each of the presidents, just to give us some kind of cliff notes to go off of. And I'll add some things, of course, of my own to that. And then we're also going to be referring to C-SPAN, and just for reference and just to see how they've been ranked historically in historian surveys over the last 22 years, 23 years now. And you can see how some of them have remained relatively the same, and others we're going to see that have improved over time. Ulysses Grant, perfect example. In 2000, historians rated him 33rd, but he's seen a resurgence, and a new look at his presidency now has him in the top half of presidents. We are also not going to be ranking every single president. So apologies to those of you excited to see where I was going to rank people like Joe Biden and Donald Trump. We're just not going to rank them. I feel strongly that you cannot fairly judge a presidency for at least 20 years, if not longer. There's just too much recency bias, and we haven't really had an opportunity to see exactly what choices they made have long-term impacts. So don't bother arguing with me about that or say, oh, well, yeah, that might be true, but this person we can certainly judge because of this, because that's what you guys are going to do, some of you. It's just not going to happen. So that means, since we're talking 20 years, I will not be judging Biden, Trump, Obama, or George W. Bush. I just don't think we're there yet. So we'll end our rankings with Bill Clinton, and I'm going to go in order just to keep things as simple as possible. All right, so let's start with George Washington. George Washington, here's how I'm going to do this, I should mention too. I've got this set up on Tier Maker, 1 through 5, 6 through 10, 11 through 15, etc. Obviously, we're not going to go up all the way to 45. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to place them about where I think they're going to end up. But then as we get further and further, I may adjust these rankings. And so I might put somebody who I think is going to be top 5, but then realize, yeah, you know what? I think somebody else deserves to be there more, and I might bump them down into the 6 through 10 range. So they're going to be moving around a little bit in these rankings, but I think it's pretty clear to me that George Washington who comes in as the first president of the United States when there hasn't been a president under the Constitution. So he's got a role that's very much undefined. And he's got the job of defining that role, setting precedents, showing people what that looks like. I think he's going to probably be a top 5 for me. We'll see where he ends up by the time we're done. But I think the overall rankings where historians have had him 3rd or 2nd are pretty accurate and pretty fair. He keeps the country neutral at a time when there's a lot of push for him to get involved in supporting France in its revolution and then in the wars that it gets into in Europe after the revolution. But he keeps the country neutral. He tries to stay above partisan politics. He warns against factions, but there's just so much wisdom to the way he led and to how he stepped down as a way of helping the country learn what it means to move on and rejecting what could have amounted to a de facto monarchy. Not perfect. He probably leans a little too heavily on Alexander Hamilton and lets him kind of run the show a lot. I like Hamilton, but not perfect. Not going to be number 1 for me, but I think he's going to be in the top 5 by the time we're all said and done. We are going to rank these 1 through all the way, so there will be a final ranking. All right, let's talk about John Adams. John Adams, a great statesman, one of our most important founding fathers, does some incredible things during his career. He's part of the committee that drafts the Declaration of Independence. He's one of the main proponents for independence. He becomes the first American ambassador to the United Kingdom, to the Court of St. James, to George III after the war, and actually makes a really positive impression, it seems, on George III. He becomes vice president for 2 terms under George Washington, but honestly, Adams' presidency is probably the worst part of his career. Everything else pretty positive. It's really tough for me to overlook the Alien and Sedition Acts. Basically, signing off on a law passed by Congress that allows you to lock up people just for speaking out against your government. And at peacetime, no less. Now, he gets some positives for continuing the policy of neutrality when there's even more increased pressure to get involved in war, to fight on the side of the French against the British. He does some positive things when it comes to the Navy. Historians tend to rank him around that kind of 15 to 20 area. I'm not feeling quite so generous toward John Adams. I'm feeling more like 20 to 25. He may end up further down than that for me, but that's where we're going to put him for now. All right, let's talk about Thomas Jefferson, consistently rated right around number 7 by historians. And I don't tend to debate with that too much. I don't personally like Thomas Jefferson. There's a lot of reasons why, and I've shared those in the past, but he's very much on the side of the pro-state government, anti-federalist. Now it's going to be called the Democratic Republicans. I feel like his view on the role of government is probably a little too naive. I get it. I get why a lot of people might see his view on states' rights as being a positive one, but Jefferson's going to be the father of the ideology that's going to lead directly to the American Civil War. He's a slave owner. He's from Virginia. He's all about states' rights and a weak federal government. And a lot of these things are going to come back to really hurt the country down the road. But he also doubles the size of the country with the Louisiana Purchase. He commissions Lewis and Clark. He's responsible for the setup of West Point, which is huge for the United States and becoming a great power by having a strong military that's going to help project that power in the 20th century. So good and bad. I think the good outweigh the bad as far as Jefferson's presidency, even if I don't necessarily like him personally. So I think he'll probably, for me, be closer to 10, 11, 12, somewhere in there, but we'll see how it all shakes out as we get a little further down the road here. Okay, we're on to James Madison. Madison, like a lot of our early presidents, is a Virginian, and like a lot of early presidents, is a Secretary of State before he ascends to the office of presidency. That was kind of the main avenue for reaching presidency. Thomas Jefferson is Secretary of State. Madison, Monroe, John Quincy Adams, these guys are Secretaries of State. So it's a pretty common thing to have happen. Madison, what does he have going for him? Again, father of the Constitution, but that's not part of his presidency. Gets us involved in this kind of trade, this major trade war thing going on, right? Where at one point the U.S. actually bans trade with both Britain and France, and then says, well, if one of them will kind of support our neutrality, then we will just stop. We'll trade with them, but we'll stop trading with the other country. And of course, gets Congress to declare war on Britain, which was not a real good idea for a young nation. We end up having our capital burned. He leads troops in the field. Doesn't really lead them in battle, but he is in the field with the Army when they go into battle in Maryland outside of D.C. So to me, he's going to be kind of a net neutral. Like, I think he has some positives, he has some negatives. He's very much against the federal government spending on infrastructure, which again, he's a Virginian, he's a pro-states' rights kind of guy. So I get that. That's true to his principles, but I don't think it's a positive for the country. So I think he's going to end up for me being in that like late teens, like around 20. Where did historians rank him? 16 to 20. Okay, so he's right in that area. That's about where I think he's going to end up for me too. All right, let's talk about James Monroe. So Monroe, where's he at? There he is right there. I think a little better than Madison. A relatively quiet administration. Not a ton that is going on that rocks the boat. Era of good feelings, He comes in the aftermath of this very turbulent time with the War of 1812. We've got the Missouri Compromise that happens during his administration, which is just kind of one of those first steps of kicking the can down the road on the issue of slavery, responsible for the Monroe Doctrine, obviously. And there's a panic that happens during his administration. Probably going to be more around the 15 range for me. Looks like historians as of late are putting him around 12th. I don't think I'd put him that high, but maybe closer to 15. All right, we're on to John Quincy Adams. Out of our first presidents, the first six, the two who do not get 2 terms are the Adams father and son combination. John Quincy Adams, probably one of the most brilliant men who have ever held the office. Super smart, really, really qualified, kind of so much on his resume. He's much more of a nationalist. He's much more about the strong federal government. He's probably pre-Civil War the last really strongly outspoken anti-slavery president. Even the presidents you have from the North after this are going to tend to be real wishy-washy or even pro-South when it comes to the slavery issue. But that is not the case with John Quincy Adams. He, unlike previous presidents, is all about infrastructure, and he comes in with this real strong idea of wanting to invest in roads, bridges, canals, stuff like that. But he also has this cloud hanging over him. The election of 1824 pits him against Andrew Jackson, and you have what's called the corrupt bargain because nobody gets a majority. And so there's kind of this deal that gets struck where Henry Clay's votes are going to go to John Quincy Adams. And it's probably one of the main reasons Adams was not reelected when he ran against Jackson again. So he's a tough one for me. I'm curious to see how he's ranked by historians. So he's going to be, again, right there, right in that middle. We're going to have a couple more right in the middle, and then we're going to have some really low-ranked ones. So, I think I'm going to put him after Madison, probably closer to the end of that 20 area. He might end up down even lower in a tier than there. This is a guy who ends up going back and serving in Congress after he was president. Again, one of those ones where it feels like the good and the bad kind of offset each other and just kind of right there in the middle somewhere. Very elitist, very much like thought he was better than the lowly average man, which is going to really be the total opposite of the next president, which is Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson's a tough one for me because I can see some good things during his administration, but man, for me, the bad just so heavily outweighs those things. I'm trying to find, there he is, right there. For me, he's going to be more like, yeah, I have a hard time putting him behind John Adams, though. Where do the historians put Andrew Jackson? So he was as high as 13. He's another one of those ones, because of modern viewpoints on things like racism and slavery and that kind of stuff like that, you're going to see presidents like Andrew Jackson really take a tumble in recent years with that heavy focus on that. I feel like he's, for me, higher than, honestly, I think he might even be higher than John Quincy Adams for me. No, you know what? I can't take a guy who basically spat in the face of the separation of powers the way that he did. You know, the Supreme Court rules against him, and then he says, well, they made the ruling, let's see him enforce it, and then just ignored it. Responsible in large part for the Indian removal, which leads to the Trail of Tears. The last time the U.S. has no national debt, though, takes place during Jackson's administration, which I think is probably a very positive thing that we could really use right now. But some of those negatives, man, it's just tough to look past that. Let me see if there's anything I'm forgetting. You have a bank war, another panic, 1837. He is very much a proponent of the common man, the idea of meritocracy, the idea that even if you're born with nothing, that you can rise to the highest levels. He's very much a pioneer. He's our last president who you could consider to be a Revolutionary War veteran, even though he was really kind of a teenager at that time. He had a scar from being struck by a British officer, when he was like telling him to shine his boots. But yeah, the Trail of Tears is tough, man, and some of the financial stuff did not go so well. But it's a mixed bag with Andrew Jackson. All right, we're on to Martin Van Buren. This is going to start our stretch of some poorer presidents. There's going to be a couple decent ones in here, but where's Martin Van Buren and his amazing hair that he had? I guess that's him right there, isn't it? Yeah. Van Buren, he's very much a meh president, right? Like, big negative for him is he comes in after Jackson's administration, right? And he's very much a continuation of Jacksonian policies, but you had that panic of 1837, and honestly, Van Buren probably made it worse rather than better. He really didn't do anything to improve the situation, so that's a big negative, and there really aren't very many positives for his 4 years in office. I want to see where historians rank him. So he was as high as 30. He's now more around 34 these days. I think that's probably pretty accurate. That's about where I've got him to. He's just a president that there isn't much remembered about him. Because honestly, other than the fact that he sucked on the economy, he didn't do much one way or the other. What does it say here about him? Democratic divorce bill, independent treasury bill, delayed actions to end the panic of 1837 caused economic downturn to continue for many years. William Henry Harrison, then we're going to move on to him. Again, not one we can really rank. He's going to go into the NA category as well. He was president for a month. I mean, there's just really not much you can say one way or the other about William Henry Harrison. And yes, I do know that I got John Quincy Adams and Martin Van Buren backwards. I was looking at the pictures. I'm like, wait a second. That looks a lot more like John Quincy Adams than it does like Martin Van Buren. And then I realized that this one was Martin Van Buren. So corrected. All right, we've got that fixed. All right, let's go ahead and move on then to our next president. We are on to John Tyler, who becomes president because William Henry Harrison dies in office. He's our first vice president to ascend to the presidency because of a death of the president. He's a tough one for me. I feel like he could have been better had he had a little more, if he had been elected in his own right, I think he probably would have had a little more influence, a little more authority. He vetoes the Bank of the United States, which was an early, that and tariffs are big issues economically for all the early presidents. Again, another one-term president. He's never elected in his own right, but he sets the wheels in motion that are going to lead to annexation of Texas, and then, of course, to the Mexican-American War, which are things that are going to be net benefits to the United States, even if they're not necessarily good things outside of the United States. Tyler's going to be ranked pretty low, down near the bottom. I'm not entirely sure I'd put him that low to the bottom for me personally. So let's go ahead and grab John Tyler here. I'm going to put him a little more in the Martin Van Buren realm of things, but we'll see where he ends up after we get through all these others here. So James Knox Polk, again, another one-term president. Look at this time period. So of the first 7 presidents, you're going to have 5 that serve 2 terms. Quincy Adams, John Adams are only one-term presidents. But after that, you've got one term, and in fact, less than a term in many cases. One term. Lincoln, the next person after Andrew Jackson, who's the 7th president, the next person who's going to serve a full 8 years in office as president is going to be Ulysses S. Grant from 69 to 77. So we have a stretch there of like almost a dozen presidents who don't serve a full 2 terms. Lincoln was elected to a 2nd term, but of course does not serve it. But Polk is a good president. He negotiates He negotiates the Oregon country issues that we're having up there in the Northwest, Pacific Northwest with Britain. We get all that solved and figure out the border there. The Mexican-American War adds a great deal of territory to the United States. He was somebody who promised to only serve 1 term and followed through on that promise, and then dies right after leaving office. To me, probably a 10 to 15 range. James Polk, he's been as high as 12, more like 18 these days. Again, there's a kind of a skewing toward kind of that anti-imperialist view. Anybody who was involved in expansionism, somebody who led an aggressive war of conquest, which is really what the Mexican War was. And of course, being a slave, pro-slavery Southerner, all of those things are going to tend to make historians view you more negatively all the time in this day and age. So where is James Polk? These are not in order, so it makes it a little bit of a challenge. Darn it. Is he colored? Oh, that's why. He was colored. I was looking at black and white ones. So James Polk had that awesome mullet going on. For me, he's going to be in that 10 to 15 range. Honestly, I think I'd probably put him ahead of James Monroe. I think I will. All right, let's talk about Zachary Taylor. 3rd shortest presidency. Only William Henry Harrison and James Garfield served less time in office. Taylor's only president for a little over a year. He's also really the first president with no kind of political experience of any kind prior to becoming president. He's one of the heroes of the Mexican War. He runs against another prominent general from the war, Winfield Scott, for the nomination for the Whigs. There's also a real strong third-party candidacy, from Martin Van Buren and Charles Francis Adams. But he gets elected, and really most people don't even know what it is he stands for politically, because he's a general. He hasn't really spoken out much. He doesn't really have much of a use for politics. But even though he's a Southerner and kind of pro-slavery at heart, he actually does a pretty good job of walking the line between the 2 factions and doesn't really push for aggressive expansion of slavery like a lot of pro-Southern, pro-slavery presidents have done. He pushes for states like California to go straight to statehood rather than becoming territories first, so he can kind of sidestep the issue of whether or not they're going to have slavery. You have the Compromise of 1850, which takes place at the end of his presidency. Honestly, didn't really do anything negative, but just wasn't around long enough to have had a strong positive. And I think in the midst of some pretty terrible presidents, he wasn't all that bad. Historians are going to tend to rank him pretty low just because his presidency was so short. But he's been as high as 28, down to around 35 now. for me personally, whereas General Taylor, there he is right there. I'm gonna put him closer to like around 30, but we'll see where it shakes out once we start filling this in a little more. He may get bumped around a little bit. So we're on to Millard Fillmore, and as I mentioned with the Compromise of 1850 during talking about Zachary Taylor, the actual compromise is going to happen in September of 1850, so that's when Fillmore's president. Fillmore was very involved in that, but the whole ball had gotten rolling under Zachary Taylor, and he kind of pushed things in the direction they ended up going. Fillmore had been a very powerful congressman years earlier. Had almost become Speaker of the House, but then just kind of... I don't know what his presidency was all about. It was not good. You have the Fugitive Slave Act, which comes in as part of the compromise. You have a second era of good feelings, but honestly, Fillmore to me was bad. To this point in history, probably one of the worst presidents. And you're going to see he's ranked pretty consistently near the bottom. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time on Millard Fillmore. He runs for president again in 52 and then again in 56. Doesn't get the nomination in 52 while he's actually the president of the United States, can't get his own party's nomination. Runs as like a third party candidate in 56 and then is very supportive of Andrew Johnson on his Reconstruction policies, which was not to his benefit, though that's not part of his actual presidency. So there's Buchanan. I'm just looking through all the presidents here. All right, so Alec Baldwin, let's get him where he needs to go. He's going to be our lowest ranked president thus far. And I say thus far because Franklin Pierce is next. Oh, Franklin Pierce. I have a lot of sympathy for Franklin Pierce because I know the demons he struggled with personally with the death of his son. Decapitated in a train accident basically right in front of him. His wife blamed him being president for their misfortune in life. He's an alcoholic who spends a lot of his administration drunk. He's a northern president who's very pro-southern in his policies. He really does not do any favors to the United States in the lead up to the American Civil War. Honestly, I can think of very little positive to say about him, and there's a reason why he's ranked so near to the bottom. And I agree that Franklin Pierce, who looks dashing in his uniform, he was another general from the Mexican War, is going to be ranked below Millard Fillmore. And then James Buchanan's going to be ranked below him. James Buchanan... again, a guy who just, and you can see here, these guys are ranked right near the bottom. And I'll say this in their defense. It was going to take an extraordinary president to make something useful of the 1850s as the nation descended into civil war. I think once the Compromise of 1850 happens, once the Fugitive Slave Act is passed, which, listen, was only reinforcing something that was already written into the Constitution about slavery. Once those things happened, polarization is really starting to set in, and the country is headed toward a no turning back scenario that's going to lead to civil war. And it just so happened that then we get a series of very weak leadership, very much weak leadership in these presidents in that decade leading up to the Civil War, which either sped it up or just were there and it was inevitable. But all three of those guys were just, there's very little positive to be said about their presidencies. All right, Abraham Lincoln. I think I've made it pretty clear over time that I think very positively of Lincoln's presidency. He's definitely a guy that's going to go in the top 5. For me personally, he goes behind George Washington. Only because, for me, Washington's presidency, there's so much about it that I feel like anybody else would not have been able to do the way Washington did. There's a humility about Washington. There's a strength of character and leadership. Washington was not a great general on the battlefield, but he was a phenomenal leader. He's one of the best leaders we've ever had as president. And he set so many precedents. Lincoln also sets some precedents, but not necessarily always in a positive way. Very shrewd politician, very methodical in how he was willing to deal with certain things, and at times could be less than above board on how he dealt with things. I don't think there's any proof that this statement was actually spoken, but there's a line in the movie Lincoln that describes Lincoln pretty well. When he talks about the passage of the 13th Amendment in the House, he says the greatest measure, it's Tommy Lee Jones's character talking. He says the greatest measure of the 19th century passed by corruption, aided and abetted by the purest man in America. That was Abraham Lincoln in a nutshell. I can't overlook him locking up political opponents. Listen, granted, he was facing what no other president has had to face, which is an act of rebellion by a third of the country in breaking away from the other two-thirds. Did he always handle it perfectly? No. Did he handle it really well? Yeah. Would the war have been shorter if he had let his generals do their job and not meddle in every little detail? Yeah, probably. So to me, he's not going to be the top one or two. He's probably going to end up probably third by the time it's all said and done. But definitely deserves to be in the top. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking. I think everybody's familiar with Abraham Lincoln and the complexity of everything. He will always be viewed as one of our great presidents. Historians are going to put him number one. He's been number one in every ranking. I just can't put him that high. And then that brings us to Andrew Johnson. To me, quite possibly, Andrew Johnson's presidency was the most destructive overall to the United States. I look at who I've got at the bottom right now with Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, and James Buchanan, and their presidencies were not good. But I don't think any of those three actively made decisions that had a lasting negative long-term impact that is still being felt today, the way that Andrew Johnson did. He's a Southern Democrat who's put on the ticket with Abraham Lincoln as what's called the Union ticket. It's kind of viewed as this attempt at bringing harmony and peace between Republican and Democrat, between North and South. He's very much a pro-slavery guy, but he remained loyal to the Union. Was the wartime governor of Tennessee. He's from East Tennessee, which is a very pro-Union part of the South. But his decisions set back the circumstances for African Americans, for the freedmen, as they were called, the newly freed slaves, set them back 100 years or more and did lasting damage to this country that we are still feeling today and still dealing with today. Honestly, I think when all is said and done, Andrew Johnson is going to be my lowest ranked president. Now, I have 41 to 45, but recognizing that I've got 4 that aren't being ranked, 45, 4, 44, 43, 42, 41 is going to be our last place. So really, that's as low as we're going to go. So I don't see anybody knocking Andrew Johnson out of that spot. All right, we're on to Grant. And Grant's one of those guys who, I want to see where Andrew Johnson was ranked by historians. He's just above James Buchanan in these rankings and has been every time. But that brings us now to Grant, who has seen a resurgence, and I think rightly so. In 2000, historians ranked him 33rd. He's now up to 20. And I think that's probably a fair place for him to be. I'd put him right in that James Madison, John Quincy Adams area. I think that's a pretty solid place for him. If it weren't for the corruption that took place during his administration, which he was not responsible, well, I shouldn't say responsible, he wasn't involved in. Was he responsible? Yes, because he put those people in those positions. Grant could be too trusting. He could be too naive at times. You all know my affinity for him as a person. Of all these men who have served as president, I think he's the one I'd most want to be friends with, that I'd most want to hang out with. Just a very genuinely good and decent person, much like Jimmy Carter is in that way. I could not say enough positive things about Grant. He's a great general, great leader, sometimes a poor judge of character, unfortunately, for him and for his family. But a heroic man, a brave man, did much more than I think people give him credit for in terms of the way he tried to pick up the pieces after Andrew Johnson's presidency and try to make something out of the situation. I think if Grant had succeeded Lincoln, the whole trajectory of our country is different in a positive way. And the situation for African Americans in the South especially is much, much better in the decades to come. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. So he comes in with a big mess to clean up. He does a lot. He takes down the Klan. He does a lot to try and make things as fair as possible for folks in the South, for those freedmen. But unfortunately, the odds are stacked against him, and it becomes increasingly difficult to do that because the mood of the country turns against the idea of continued Reconstruction. A big negative on Grant is, of course, the handling of the Indians' Wars, as they're called, turning on the treaty that had been made over the Black Hills. It's impossible to ignore that. It's definitely a stain on his administration, but I think around 20 is probably a pretty fair place for him. All right, let's talk about Rutherford B. Hayes a little bit. Obviously, when people think of Rutherford B. Hayes, they think of Rutherford. They think of the whole thing with him and Tilden. Tilden wins the popular vote. There's some argument about some of the states in the South and their electoral votes, and a commission throws all the votes to Hayes because the commission's dominated by Republicans and Hayes is a Republican. But I think people kind of overstep when they start arguing that, well, Hayes basically sold out African Americans in the South by ending Reconstruction to become president. Irrelevant. Samuel Tilden would have ended Reconstruction too. It's not like Hayes was coming in and somehow if Tilden had won the election that miraculously Reconstruction was going to continue. Public opinion was very much against Reconstruction. Grant was having a hard time enforcing Reconstruction at the end of his administration. Tilden would have ended it anyway, so Hayes was just doing what was probably inevitable, but it's still kind of a stain on him. He did choose not to run for re-election. That was a promise he made and he kept. He really gets the ball rolling on civil service reform, which is going to be continued under Garfield and Arthur and presidents that are going to come after him. The focus more on merit and on ability rather than who supported your campaign the most and who the political cronies are, which is a huge, important step. So for that, for me personally, I think maybe he probably should be viewed a little higher than he is otherwise. Historically, he's been as high as 25. He's kind of low 30s now, or like upper 30s, I guess you would say, depending on how you look at it. I think that's probably pretty fair. I'm going to drop him right around 30 for now, and we'll see how that all shakes out. Like I said, once we start filling in the rest of these, we're only halfway there. We're going to start to see exactly where some of these folks are going to end up falling in the line. So by the time we get up to George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, we'll have 5, 10, 15, 20. We'll have them all ranked 1 through 41 with the 4 that I haven't chosen to rank at all. But we're going to wrap up right here. I don't want this to be an insanely long video. So I'm going to just do the first half here. We're going to come back tomorrow with part 2. But if you are watching this after the video has gone live and you want to see part 2, patrons and members can access part 2 a day early, as you can with all videos. But if you're watching this a day early already, you still have to wait till tomorrow to watch it. So let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. What did I get right? What did I get wrong? Who would you move in terms of the order that we have so far? And just use the comments to let me know those things. We'll be back tomorrow with part 2. Thanks for watching.